for example, when Justice Bork came up for his hearings in the 1980s, it was thought that by many liberals it was not a good thing if you believed in natural law, that this implied some kind of very rigid hold on a very conservative notion of what should and shouldn't be. On the other hand, you could say that if you believe in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, if you believe that something such as human rights exists at all, that it is based on some form of natural law. And that you could even make a case that the Declaration of Independence is in some way based on a form of natural law. Whether you believe in it in a religious sense or simply in a sense of the existence of sentient conscious beings. So I don't know how or whether one should apply this to these writers, but it does seem to me that given their sense of freedom, their sense of moral positioning, and also their sense of embattlement over these questions, that they may all hold in some way or another to a version of natural law. Now, natural law, like anything, can be perverted. The Spanish used to have long discussions in natural law about natural law making it perfectly viable to hold slaves because they were inferior beings, naturally, and so forth. So it all depends upon what version of natural law you talk about. But when Edmund Burke makes the argument that the East India Company should be out of India, he bases it basically on a natural law, saying, yes, they have a charter to do business in India, but they don't have a charter to rape, pillage, and steal. That violates the natural rights of every Indian. And so that's an argument from natural law. Well, one of the things I think it makes it very hard to do as a result of the things that we've been discussing is classify these writers politically or ethically as conservative or liberal. I just find it very hard to do that. You can say they're conservative in some respects, undoubtedly that's true. But you can also say that what they did in many sense was liberating and produced a greater sense of freedom or justice and enlarged the ability of other individuals to exercise that freedom, that it enfranchised a great many more people or prevented many people from being disenfranchised. So to me that's a very hard thing. I just grow increasingly, I guess, in part tired and disgusted with the terms conservative and liberal as they are constantly flung around these days in political conversations and in intellectual history. We talked, and we'll talk more, I'm sure, about the sense of honesty in these writers. Yet, this sense of honesty, I think, it's funny because it's not at all in any way a naive or absolute sense. It's a funny thing. It's like Churchill saying it's more important to be right than to be honest. Or you remember Samuel Johnson writes, and I think it's in The Life of Savage, he says, friendship is a virtue not always conducive to honesty. That's one kind of honesty. So you can be an honest friend, but that is itself not conducive to honesty. Or, you know, Churchill would tell lies or withhold information. So I recall that he knew perfectly well that Coventry was going to be bombed. Isn't that right? He knew it. But he knew that if he let it be known that he knew that the Germans would realize that the whole German code for World War II had been cracked. And so Coventry was bombed. And the British High Command, at least Churchill and a few others, knew that it was a target. Churchill's statement is a very sobering one. In war, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. This is a chilling statement in some ways. In war, it's qualified by saying in war. So this sense of honesty is in part, I think, tied up to not being self-deluded, I guess. being honest about your own motives and your own knowledge. There's this great scene, I don't know if you remember the old movie Lawrence of Arabia. There's this great scene where this fellow from the Chicago newspaper is interviewing one of the Arab princes who's fighting with Lawrence and saying, well, you know, Lawrence is really quite a person. There's a kind of brutal honesty about him, and I think the Arab prince says something about, no, wait a minute, he says, I think I've got it right. This is something like, Lawrence tells half-truths, and people who tell half-truths rather than lies often tend to forget where they put the truth. Whereas if you tell a lie, you know where the truth is. In other words, fudging with things. Love of poetry and love of literature from an early age, an earned and relative lack of success in schooling and formal education, especially when measured against the enormous talent and ambition of each of these people. And the interesting thing here is it's poetry, but it's literature in a way that we don't mean literature often. In other words, it's not what used to be called just belles lettres or aesthetic poems, plays, novels. It's literature meaning the written record of human experience, which means a lot of history and a lot of biography and a lot of intellectual prose. And it was like Harry Truman says. Harry Truman said, you know, if you want to be a leader in the public sphere, you should read history and biography from early on. And you know, Truman was not what we would call a highly educated person either, but if you go to the Truman Library in Independence and you look at the replica of the Oval Office there, and you look at the books in it, which are the exact books that Truman had in the Oval Office, they didn't just throw volumes in there, you see an enormous number of volumes of history, biography. So Truman was a real reader. That he wasn't, you know, just a haberdasher. And he had this enormous sense of background in reading. Yet, you know, Johnson, who in many ways wanted to study law, Oxford dropout, couldn't pay the bills. Comes back later to get an honorary degree from Oxford, but basically he's a failure as an academic. He leaves Oxford with great bitterness. He leaves one box of books when he goes away from Oxford, I think almost certainly in the hope that he would come back sometime to complete his undergraduate degree, which he never did. And of course we know about Lincoln's lack of formal education, though he read and studied an enormous amount in his 20s and 30s. They all had models of one kind or another, somewhat different for their learning. And I think those models are important. The teachers, whether it's Cornelius Ford or even the fact that Johnson's father owned a bookshop, which Johnson read voraciously in. Or in the case of Churchill, this man named Mr. Somerville, who taught at Harrow, who taught not a very highly regarded subject, namely English composition. It wasn't important as the classics. I mean, Churchill was a lousy Latin and Greek scholar. He couldn't learn Latin, basically, apparently. He had terrible trouble with it. But he stayed for 3 terms in the quote, the third, fourth term, which apparently is a kind of C- level of, you know, Harrow, where you're not going up to the 4th or the 5th, you're in the 3rd, 4th term. So he said as a result, he had to study English composition with Mr. Somerville 3 times, rather than just once. He said, that's where I got into my bones the natural rhythms and sense of an English sentence. Now, people say Churchill made too much of that. I'm not so sure. It's probably just a kind of, you know, teacher's vanity, but I'd like to think that when people credit their teachers for things, there's something to it. I'll come across another instance in just a few minutes, but I actually believe that Churchill was, no, I think that's right. Coleridge said James Boyer at Christ Hospital School taught him a great deal and sent him off to university. I think that's right. I think James Boyer changed Coleridge's life. It wouldn't have been the same without him. Also, an extremely retentive memory. Each one of these individuals has an incredible memory. And memory is related to attention. Memory is related to what you care about. We all know that now. I mean, Churchill recited 1,200 lines from Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome at Harrow School, won a prize for it. 1,200 lines, that's pretty good. Johnson had this enormously retentive memory. Lincoln has a superb memory. Lincoln knew a lot of poetry by heart. He knew a lot of Burns by heart. He knew a lot of other poems. He used to recite this